We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm your host on Mostly Economics. Thank you for joining us here today. Today we have with us Doug Harris, who's professor and chair of the Department of Economics at Tulane University, and he's also the director of the State of the Nation Project. So thank you for joining us, Doug.
Thanks for having me, Dean.
So why don't we start State of the Nation Project? You had a great write-up in the Times, New York Times, a little while back, and a number of people saw it, but a number of people probably didn't. So why don't we start by having you tell us what the project is, what the motivation for it was, and who's bought into it? Who do you have on board with it?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So it's an unusual project. I know most of the folks on the podcast are usually they have a project, or they had a question and they're trying to answer the question, or they've done a bunch of research on a particular topic. This is a pretty different kind of project, but the name describes it pretty well. State of the Nation Project. The idea was to come up with a kind of progress report for the country, and that was motivated by a few things. I think one is the just general sense that we're off track. Things are really not going well in the country, and trying to better understand why that is. The polarization, distrust, pessimism. It seems like a bad situation. And I think a lot of people had pointed out and had seen all these things are happening at once. At the same time, the economy is actually doing pretty well overall relative to other countries and so on. We can talk about the details and things that are not going well, but look at the long-term trajectory of the economy and the future and so on. Things are bright, but everything else seems to not be so bright. So the idea was to see whether we could, whether a wide-ranging group of people might be able to come together to try to describe how we're doing and assess how we're doing as a country in a way that we could all agree with across the political spectrum, across disciplines. And so we've got a wide-ranging board. We've got representation from 7 different think tanks, national think tanks, including EPI and Brookings and AEI and others, including the America First Policy Institute and Hoover and others that are very much on other sides of today's debates. So interestingly, we weren't sure whether we'd be able to agree on anything, but it turns out that we did.
Well, I'll just say I appreciate the efforts, and we all could be cynical. I'm certainly cynical often of kind of meeting across the table here, but they can be valuable. And I'm going to say I have learned. I've engaged. I remember Bill Niskanen. He might predate your time in D.C., but he was head of the Cato Institute for a number of years. He actually been in the Reagan administration, and then he headed up the Cato Institute. And he's someone I'd call a genuine libertarian. Mm-hmm. And I actually will say, I'm saying genuine libertarian because I actually believe that people often are libertarians because they want to cut taxes on the rich. But he might want to cut taxes on the rich, but he also believed in the idea of less government. And I remember once debating him, and we were talking about, the tax cuts with Reagan, because if you go far enough back, we had 90% marginal tax rates. And he had done some simple calculations. He's going, wait, 90% income tax, then sales tax or whatever. And you get to, I forget, 98, maybe it's even over 100%. And I shot back at him. I said, oh, come on, no one paid that. And Bill said, well, if you have a tax that no one's paying, it's probably not a very good tax. And I shut up and realized that it's a good point.
Yeah, that's fair.
So anyhow, I just appreciate the effort because, again, I'll say that, a lot of times these end up, to my view, at least being relatively foolish. But, when you can bring in people with different perspectives and actually engage honestly, that's the key thing, I think.
Well, I think especially these days where I think I had a sense before that we agreed probably on more than what it appeared, based on political discourse and what the parties are saying and what's showing up on the talking heads and so on, that I think our instinct was it's probably not that bad, but we weren't really sure whether we'd be able to agree on this or not.
Yeah.
So.
Why don't we start with, what do you see as kind of the key findings, of this research? I mean, again, some people may have already seen some of them. But what do you see as the key findings so we could go into a little bit?
So we ended up agreeing on, with a supermajority of this group, meaning about 75% of the board had to agree for a topic or a measure to get into the report. We ended up with 15 topics and 37 measures, some of which, of course, were tied to the economy, but a lot of them were not. So two of the topics were the economy itself and work. Were two topics, and education is kind of adjacent to that as well. And so just focusing on that general topic, if you view that as the economic umbrella, that we seem to be in good shape over the long haul. We're talking about going back to 1990 and looking at the long-term trajectories. We're not looking at this year versus last year. And this was also, I will say, this started during the Biden administration. This was before the current Trump policies that you could imagine maybe putting us on a different track. But, as of when we were writing this back in the fall, that we thought that the economy is strong and it's on track to remain strong. It's in many ways the envy of the world, and that's very likely to continue. That there was no reason to see otherwise. So that was the first conclusion. But then all the other conclusions, that was the only good news really in the report was that we looked at, especially the subjective well-being measures like depression, anxiety, life satisfaction, trust, and various institutions, trust in other people, emotional support, almost everything where you're asking people about how their lives are going, all heading downhill, even as the economy, as average income at least, continues to rise. And that was really the striking thing. That's what the New York Times focused on in their piece, was this disconnect between income and wealth on the one hand, at least on average, and the subjective well-being.
Yeah, just one of the things, again, of course, you're well aware of this, but it's important to point out to people that when we take averages of something like income or wealth, they're very skewed. I mean, whether we happen to include Elon Musk in the sample or not, you get a very, very different story. Whereas when we ask about, broad measures for the population, I have no idea whether Elon Musk is happy or not, but let's imagine for a moment he's tremendously happy. It's not going to matter much when you add him in with however many other people you have in your sample.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's right. And we have an income inequality measures. That was another topic that was in the report. So we include income inequality, recognizing exactly what you're saying. And that's as much as the average economy is looking fine, income inequality is not, clearly. And we're doing poorly relative to other countries and getting worse over time. Nothing new to you or new to probably most of these listeners, but we all agreed. And again, kind of interesting that we got a supermajority of the board to agree that should be in there, which it's not something that conservatives necessarily support all the time.
Just out of curiosity, I know you have the 75% cutoff. Were there dissenters? And I don't know if everyone's supposed to be anonymous or not, but you could just tell me whether or not there were dissenters on the issue of income inequality.
Yeah, there were dissenters for sure. In fact, there was only one measure that had unanimous support. There were most of the topics had unanimous support, but not all. But very few of the measures did. Income inequality, I think, was on the lower end of support. I honestly don't. I do know I have documentation of who voted for what, but that part.
I don't care about revealing confidence.
Yeah. So yes, there was dissent on that for sure, but not a lot.
So I'm interested because I've seen other measures, and obviously you put a lot of time into this in terms of the subjective measures. I'm going to mention my wife happens to be Danish. She's at Denmark generally, and I forget how they did on your scores here, but they generally do very well on these satisfaction and other measures. So she's kind of a dour Dane. She says, well, that's because everyone goes, well, it could be worse. So again, I'm not saying that's necessarily an accurate description of Danes in general, but how do you deal with a subjective measure like that? Because it's always, inevitably it's going to be somewhat compared to your expectations. If you thought you're going to be tremendously rich and you have a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, you might say, oh, I'm unhappy. Whereas, if you just came from a working-class background and you end up having a comfortable meal, you'd probably be pretty happy. So how do you think about that? How people in the group, who worked on this, how do they think about that?
Well, I think what you're talking about goes to partly to the interpretation of why, right? So why might the averages would be going in the wrong direction. So it could have something to do with, as you say, the expectations are just different. And I think one of the reasons why we reported the numbers in different ways. So we reported a trend line. Are we going up or down? Which is kind of interesting by itself. So if we think that expectations are relatively constant, then and they might not be, but if they're constant, then if we're declining, then it tells you, okay, well, that's not good news. Or if we're declining relative to other countries, which is another thing we reported, well, that's interesting too, because you expect maybe their expectations are heading in the same direction. But on the subject of measures, for the most part, we're doing bad on all three ways you could report it. We're going down in an absolute sense, we're low in an absolute sense relative to other countries, and we're declining relative to other countries. So it's like you could parse a little bit in the way you described that. Well, maybe it's expectations are changing or something, but it's hard to explain all of those things being bad at the same time.
Yeah. No, I'd agree I'm curious. And again, I did read the piece, read some of your work, but were there other countries that had the downward trend? I know most did, but were there other countries that had a downward trend?
We didn't look at it that way, partly because we were already looking at it in so many different ways. We really focused on the U.S. numbers, and so we really reported the U.S. trend relative to other countries, but we didn't report every country separately and report all the rankings. It was just too much because we had so many. We had 37 measures, each reported three different ways, so it just became a little bit too much.
Yeah, well, I do know with some measures, this is an important one, with health measures, the U.S. has been very much an outlier because, again, this is what I'm somewhat familiar with, that if you go back to 1970, it really is quite striking because, again, it's one of the things I suspect a lot of people don't know. I didn't know until I happened to look at it. I was very curious about the issue that if you look at life expectancies of the wealthy countries, we're pretty much at the bottom. It probably depends who you add in. If you throw in Chile, well, we might even be below Chile now. I don't know. Yeah. But we're pretty much at the bottom. But if you go back to 1970 or whatever, I don't know, whatever, the first year we have reasonably good data for the different countries, we're very much in the middle, maybe even at the high end. So we went from being, a relatively healthy country to being, very unhealthy. And it's not that it fell. We did obviously have a fall with the pandemic, and you probably are more up to date on the numbers than I am, but we did have some fall in life expectancy and other health measures. So it's not that alone. Yeah. But we had a fall in health measures associated with that. But mostly it's just that we had very little increase compared to, pick your country, Germany, France, Canada, they all had much greater increases. So you had countries that were level with us, or in many cases below us, if you go back 50 years, and now they're above us. And that's kind of a striking story.
I think one of the most interesting things is that we had an absolute decline in life expectancy before COVID. And this is, I think, hasn't gotten as much attention as it ought to. Some of this was related to the opioid crisis, but I think it reflected, the overall kind of flat growth separate from the opioid crisis. And so that was enough to tip the balance so that life expectancy actually dropped. And again, that was not, economically speaking, and in other dimensions, was not a bad period. This is pre-COVID, and yet we still had a drop in life expectancy during that period.
Yeah,
even though we had been talking about the subjective well-being measures, but a lot of the other measures too are not going in a positive direction. Life expectancy being on that list too, that we're not doing especially well. We're at, right now, we included middle and higher income countries in our comparison, and we're at the 62nd percentile basically, and in that group. That's a larger group than what you were including in yours.
Yeah. No, that is striking, particularly given how much we do spend on healthcare, because our per person healthcare spending pretty much dwarfs anyone else. I don't think you have a few countries that might be about 60 or 70% of us, but no one's really close. And a lot of them, many of the countries I know, UK, again, the most recent data, but recently was about half, maybe even a little less than half on a per person basis. And a lot of problems with their healthcare. So if we have anyone who's familiar with the UK system, they're jumping up and down yelling at this problem, which is all true. But, at the end of the day, they still manage to have much better outcomes than we do.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm curious, you mentioned the opioid crisis, and I don't know how, I'm forgetting where you're still going forward with this, or is this like a one and done
Oh, no, it's ongoing exercise. So the next project is going to be a state of the states version, where we're taking the measures from state of the nation and taking it down to the state level and putting maps on the website, and so you can see visually which states are doing better than others on these measures. And so that'll be the next.
I was raising in connection with the opioid crisis because I've been seeing, again, I will claim zero expertise on this, just what I read in the paper. But, we've seen evidence that opioid deaths, fentanyl deaths are dropping. And, I have no idea whether that will be sustained or not, or whether further research will hold up those declines. But that is a very encouraging trend. I mean, again, I don't know how much that corresponds to other things in the economy and society, but that is a very encouraging trend.
Yep, absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, some of that's the tightening down on the prescriptions. Then there's still the illegal side of the market, and there's been a lot more tightening and I think more enforcement and so on in recent years. Is that so? That it clearly has gotten better than the worst of that crisis, no doubt.
Yeah. Well, that will be certainly interesting to see. Again, assuming that continues, the downward trend in opioid deaths continues, that presumably that will be reflected in some of the other data. Again, we obviously have a lot of other things going on, particularly with the new administration, but that is at least a promising trend. And, again, not to be overly critical of the new administration, but I mean, many of the cuts were directed at things like trying to get people off opioids, recovery programs. So I don't know if that will have a noticeable effect on the trends, but it's hard not to worry about it. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, no question. It's devastated a lot of communities, especially rural communities.
So I'm curious with your education measures, because again, this is something that was, of course, very controversial. I mean, it's very controversial even prior to the COVID, but we did see a big fall in most outcome measures of education associated with the pandemic, which clearly was partly due to the school closures, but it seems to have been beyond that. Because again, you find, and again, I won't claim to be you're much more expert on the data, I'm sure, in this area than I am, but you had big declines even in areas that were closed a relatively short period of time. Which to me at least suggests that it was the pandemic itself that kind of disrupted people's lives, even beyond just that your school was closed for 2 months or whatever it was. So I'm just curious, one, what the differences you found, and I guess you'll get more to this with your state data, but the extent to which we had a downturn associated with school closings, and then I guess probably the more important thing is to what extent that's being reversed, insofar as it is, that now we're a few years out from the pandemic, to what extent the educational losses, and maybe not for those students, maybe we won't see that fully overcome, but if we look at people, in fourth grade now, or in kindergarten, I guess, when the pandemic hit, are they where a fourth grader would have been had we never seen the pandemic?
Yeah, so on just the point about test scores, no doubt we took a hit during COVID. Interestingly, other countries seem to have taken a larger hit than we did during COVID, which I think surprised a lot of people. Some of the decline.
Let me stop you on that for a second. My understanding is we had about the longest school closings than anyone, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so, that's why it was a little surprising that we didn't get hit. Nobody has a good explanation, as far as I can tell, about why that is. I think part of it is the fact that the pandemic itself. So even in the schools that went back in person in the U.S. or whether in other countries as well, that it still disrupted schooling, right? So it was disrupting life. It was people were wearing masks, which made it harder to talk and communicate. Kids were nervous. I think people were more likely to be absent from school, both teachers and students, even if things were in person. So there was all sorts of disruption, even in the in-person environments, because of the pandemic. So I think that's part of it. Going back further, before COVID, our scores had started to drop around 2014 or so. The NAEP scores, that's the U.S. Department of Education's report card measure, and so that had been happening before, and then COVID kind of exacerbated that trend, and we really dropped down basically to 1990 levels on test scores with the pandemic. But so there's also debate about what was happening before, because we had been going up till about 2014, 2015, the 1990 to 2015 or so. We had a pretty steady upward climb, and then it started to taper off. Some possibility that it was related to No Child Left Behind, and test-based accountability at the state level, which had been ratcheting up during that period, and then ESSA kind of removed a lot of the pressure from No Child Left Behind around that time. That might be one theory, but probably can't explain it all based on what the research suggests. So we don't know exactly. Could be cell phones and social media and devices is another possibility. So that's still debated. But in terms of our international rankings, we've been pretty stable or even improving over that period back to 1990. Our test scores actually improved relative to other countries during that period of time. And if you look at the other measures on the education side, we have average years of education and the percentage of young people who are either working or in school. We actually do pretty well, or generally improving or stable on those measures too. So education was actually one of the relative bright spots compared to everything else in this report.
I'm curious, obviously, we don't have that many years of data, but are we again making progress in the post-COVID years?
A little bit. We haven't, for the most part, bounced back. Some states have bounced back, including my home state of Louisiana here has bounced back to pre-pandemic levels. Most states, most schools have not bounced back. A little bit of a return, toward those prior levels, but most are not back. And I think that just reflects kind of the cumulative effects of these kinds of things. If you miss things in one grade, some of that carries forward to later grades. And then we also have the continued effects of, I think, increased use of devices and social media. All of that got worsened because of the pandemic. So those habits, the bad habits that students got into during that period, are carrying over into the later grades. Absenteeism is higher of students and teachers. So that's all holding things back.
Yeah, I'm curious. I've again, zero expertise in this area, but I've just been struck by the rates of absenteeism, again, among students, but you mentioned teachers. I've seen that as well. Again, you know the data better than I do. I'm curious, is that something, is that a similar problem in other countries? Are we a real outlier in the number of absentees?
That's a good question. I don't have an immediate answer to that. I'm not sure whether other countries are struggling as much. I think we have some idea of why. I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic is schools became much more accommodating, and they also developed more tools to allow students to learn remotely. And so I think you put those two things together, it's easier to be remote. And I think students and parents feel less guilty about not having their kids go to school than they used to. So if they don't feel like they're up to it, or they're just feeling off, they don't want to go to school, I think it's easier to say okay than it used to be because of the experience during the pandemic. It's for the most part concentrated amongst a small number of students. So it's not across the average. For most students, the absenteeism hasn't changed. It's the students who are already a little bit absent, who are absent more often than they were before. That chronic absenteeism, that's gone up. So I think that's another important distinction, that it doesn't seem to be across the board.
I'm curious. I assume that most classes, I know during the pandemic, many schools tried to do like an in-class and an online option. So a teacher would have to, which I have to imagine as a teacher would be a real pain, but
Yep.
they would be speaking to a group of students in their class, but they would also be, doing it online. And I gather you probably had teachers that did get pretty good at that, but it just, to me, sounds like that would be, pretty burdensome. Do you know if that still happens, or is it mosely, you're either in person or you're online? It's one or the other.
Yeah, I don't think hybrid is common at all anymore. So if a child's out of school, I don't think they try to Zoom them in to the classroom. I think that's pretty rare. Because you're right, that could undermine the classroom environment for everybody if they were trying to do that and make teachers' lives more difficult. But I don't think that's happening.
Yeah, I would imagine it'd be pretty hard. So, getting back to the overall measures, and again, I'm not sure how much depth you went into try to, tease this out. But did you find that the measures of happiness were closely correlated with, or inversely correlated with inequality, so that the countries that had greater overall equality had higher levels of, various measures of happiness, stability, whatever measures you had.
I think there's other evidence of that. We didn't look into it, but since then I have looked into it in a slightly different way from what you described. And that's trying to understand, going back to the inequality question, well, what do we know about how the decline in average happiness is distributed and within the country rather than looking across countries? And it does look like the decline in subjective well-being is concentrated amongst lower income people. Whereas, and at the same time, you don't see improvement. So it's not like higher income people are necessarily getting a lot happier. They're just stable for the most part at the higher income groups. But the lower income groups, at least for life satisfaction, I'm not sure I've seen that for the other subjective well-being measures. It does look like that's a big part of the story. And that could explain the overall pattern. If you have a lot of people who are not receiving income gains, for example, then if we think that we're thinking about this as a money buys happiness kind of a story, well, if you have people who aren't really receiving much income gain at the low end of the scale, then you can see why they wouldn't be getting happier. It's harder to explain why they're getting, at least from that story, unhappier, right? Because the average is going down, and they seem to be significantly less well off. So I think then we also looked into back to technology. I think a lot of the conversations kept coming back to technology as part of an underlying story, and I think that's partly a driver of the inequality, but also more directly a cause for why subjective well-being, especially amongst the low-income population, is declining. They tend to use their cell phones more, and for some of the purposes that might be most harmful, for gambling and pornography, and I think social media as well. I think it's across the board that low-income populations tend to use their devices more for all of those purposes. And so you can imagine that collectively may be partly why they're not just flattening out. They're not gaining in happiness, but they're actually declining in happiness, partly because of the way technology is shaping their lives.
Yeah, you're mentioning gambling. I've, not that I've looked at in great depth, but it's something that to my view at least, I think it's underappreciated as being a real problem. I don't just mean compulsive gamblers. I mean, it's, a lot of people can lose a lot of money. They don't have to be compulsive gamblers. I mean, obviously some people are compulsive gamblers, but, if you're, a working class person, you have a job that pays you $20 an hour and you end up losing $1,000 or $2,000, on this or that, gambling rate. That's a really big hit.
It's become a lot easier to do with all the online gaming that's taken off in the last 5 or 6 years.
Exactly. And, again, obviously, the people designing these games are designing it to make them easy for you to lose a lot of money without realizing it. Right. And, it's just kind of common sense. I mean, you have people that, they spend a lot of time designing them. And then you have, not to say anyone's stupid or anything, but it's not their job. So you have someone that you go, oh, this looks kind of neat. And before they know it, they've blown $1,000. And, again, this gets back to, this is a case where I really do think regulation makes sense, that we should make it difficult to lose $1,000. I mean, if you're really intent on losing $1,000, we can't keep you from doing that. You could, spend $1,000 on lottery tickets. We're not going to arrest someone for that. You could, go to Las Vegas and, put all your money in 32 red and the roulette wheel. We can't keep people from doing that, but we can try to make it so it's not really easy to do it. And, unfortunately, again, we have people who there's a lot of money at stake. They could spend a lot of time figuring out how to make it easy. And insofar as we have regulatory structures in place, those are being very eroded.
Gambling's become suddenly much more acceptable. And so it's not even just the interest group power behind it, although it's part of it. Part of it's the sports industry itself has decided to back it, including college sports that are actively supporting it too. So it's created, an even larger interest group in the process, essentially, because now like the universities and the sports teams, and they're all benefiting from it too.
That's right. I mean, I guess I've been, obviously it's a long time since I was in college, but I mean, you have colleges that have deals with gambling companies that,
including like sending emails out to their students, almost encouraging them to participate in it.
Yeah. Well, that could, again, that's something that would not be picked up in the income measure. So, if someone's blowing an average, I'm pulling this out of the air. If they're blowing an average 10% of their income on gambling, that would mean they have less money for everything else, for their rent and their food. That's, again, hopefully not many people are blowing 10%, but some are. And that is a really big deal. And, again, kind of unfortunate. With your data, I forget how much you went year to year. I'm just curious, because a lot of us, of course, we noted in 221, we sort of had a very expanded welfare state where we had, this is as we're coming out of the pandemic recession, and we had originally $600 per person unemployment, per week extra unemployment benefits. It was cut back. I forget whether it's the 300, 400, but that was a big supplement. So in other words, every person who's unemployed, getting unemployment benefits, originally was getting an extra $600 a week in addition to their regular benefit. And later, again, I forget whether it's I think it was $300 after, I think it was March of 221. But that's still very large. And again, you have people who are collecting that who might have been working getting $15 an hour. And, if you're working a 40-hour week and maybe we're working less, that's just $600. So you were getting your regular benefit plus originally $600, and then later $300. So long and short, you were doing, for an unemployed worker, you were doing pretty well. I'm not going to say I was doing great. And then on top of that, we'd expanded expanded Medicaid. We had extra subsidies in the Affordable Care Act, so we made healthcare much more affordable for people. We also suspended, we had moratoriums on eviction, on foreclosure. So, a long list of things. So I'm just curious if you had any, and again, I don't know how much you did year to year, if there's any evidence of, change in the happiness measures, the subjective well-being measures for 221 while those benefits were in effect.
The short answer is no, but I think it's worth explaining why the answer is no. I think part of what we were trying to do, in part because we were trying to get agreement on things, was we decided to just kind of set policy to the side for the most part and say, we're just trying to measure bottom line, how are we doing? We're not trying to necessarily agree on why we're doing well or not well in certain areas. So that would have been a lot harder question to get agreement on. So if you look at all the measures, some people say, well, we should put in investment in early childhood or investment in this, investment in that, and so on. And it's like, well, that's not really what we're trying to do, and we're not going to agree on it anyway. So we kept having to nudge back away, which is frustrating too. It was frustrating to a lot of people on the board who had their policies that they wanted to support. But I think it was important because a lot of the outcomes we're looking at are really downstream of a lot of things. Policy is one of the things that contribute to a lot of the outcomes we're looking at, but there are other things too. And I think it was meant to be a report card. How are we doing? Not necessarily why are we doing. And so we didn't get quite as fine grained as what you're asking about on that question.
Yeah. Well, no, I understand that. Perfectly good reasons. And again, having worked occasionally with more, people from conservative think tanks, I understand how hard it could be to get agreement on something like that. So they probably wouldn't take my agenda and run with it. So I understand that. But, so let me ask your timeline. So you're looking at this by state. Do you have a timeline for when you're going to?
The plan is to release that. So we released the State of the Nation in February. And by the way, if anybody wants to take a look at the website, it's very kind of easily navigable. You can kind of see the whole thing just on the homepage. You can scroll down and see the whole report card.
Yeah, let me encourage people. It's very well laid out, so it's not like our website. Anyhow, no, it's very nicely.
We're working on the State of the States. We just got some funding to be able to do that. We'll plan to release that probably in February or so as well. And then the hope is at a minimum to do a report every year. So do another State of the Nation in 2 years. We decided not to try to update it every year just because not much changes from year to year, given that we're interested in the long-term trajectory. So there wasn't going to be much to look at. And so we thought we'd just report it in a different way. And so we're working with a lot of state organizations now trying to draw more attention to these measures and to some of these issues. Another motivation for the project, I think we realized after, was that there's so much noise out there. If you think about all the newspaper headlines and so on, you hear this or that news about this or that measure. There are thousands of measures out there, and you can kind of get lost in the weeds of that. So part of what I think we're trying to do here is to say, look, these are the things that all of us, wide-ranging people, politically and otherwise, agree on. Like, these are the measures we should probably really be focusing on. Let's keep our eye on the ball about what's most important here, and then now trying to do the same thing that we did at the nation level down to the state level.
Yeah, that I'll do a general pitch. I mean, not for the specific, not to knock the specifics, but the value in getting agreed upon measures. I think it's impossible to exaggerate that, because again, we could all look at those and go, well, we prefer this one, we prefer that one. But again, I'm going to bring our politics into this with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's very valuable that we could agree that
Right.
These are the data. We all know. I'm sure you've had criticism, I've had criticisms. Bureau of Labor Statistics is not perfect, and
Right.
you could always find, could you have done something different in measuring unemployment, or how are you doing wages for people who are self-employed or tipped workers? Are you getting all, there's all sorts of things you could think about as you could try to improve the data. But the fact that the data is there and it's real, that's very, very valuable. And, that's why, say a project like this, I think you have a wide agreement from groups across the political spectrum. Here are things we could agree on. And I think that's very, very useful as a jumping off point. So others could, I'm asking you, why is this? Why is that? I understand you weren't asking that question, but, you could say, okay, here's the trend in, self-assessed happiness, self-assessed, stability, whatever, the various measures that you have in there. And, we could go, that others of us could go and look at that and try to, assess why did it fall right? So when it did, why did it fall here, but not in France or, wherever else? And, to my view, that's incredibly valuable.
Yeah. Well, one of the concerns, to your point about BLS, is that we're not sure whether we can do this report again in 2 years. Like, we can do State of the States because we already have the data, but can we do State of the Nation in 2027? I don't know. Some of these measures, we're not sure whether the data will be there. I mean, there are lots of examples where old data are being pulled down from websites. That's data that had been collected under prior administrations, but now you have the new problem of data that might actually be reported that might be distorted somehow, based on political manipulation of this, which is another problem. And we'll be on the lookout for that when we look at the data. We're only going to report data that we believe, that we think, at the very least, the trends and main patterns that we're looking at, we believe are real. And so we'll be digging into that, as we go forward, and paying attention to what the labor economists are saying, whether they believe those data or not. And hopefully the answer is yes, and we can keep using them.
Yeah, we could hope on that. So let me ask you if there's any other points that you really want to make about the project before I let you go.
Yeah, there are a few topics that we haven't covered that I think are worth mentioning. I talked about subjective well-being as kind of a broad category. One of the measures in the report is belief in democracy. I'd say this was the one that worried me maybe more than almost any other. We're in the bottom third of countries on belief in democracy. Political polarization or negative views of the opposing political party, we're last in the world on that measure, and getting worse in absolute terms by the day. So I think that one is
not a good story.
Yeah, no, it's not a pretty picture. On mental health, similarly, depression and anxiety were at the 11th percentile. Suicide, we're at the 16th percentile. And all of them are getting worse. In absolute terms, our trend is getting worse, and relative to other countries, we're getting worse on all those measures. All the trust measures too. We had trust in local government, trust in federal government, trust in police, criminal justice, colleges and universities, science. The only thing that's trending somewhat positive there, believe it or not, is trust in science, is actually improving relative to other countries. It's We don't do it special.
When you say we're improving relative to other countries, is that because it's going up here or it's going down elsewhere?
Well, that's a good question. I don't remember the answer to that question, but at least we're declining more slowly. But hopefully, we're actually improved. Actually, I can tell you we're stable in absolute terms, but other countries are seeing a drop. So that I actually can tell you from this. But on all of those measures, with the exception of trust in police, we're also near the bottom third or less in terms of how we rank relative to other countries. I think it's, again, across the board on all of these measures, we're asking people whether it's about their trust or their lives or their emotional supports. It's not looking good.
Those are big deals. The trust measure, again, picking on my sample of one. When I first visited my wife in Denmark, her family there, you'd go to a restaurant and there'd be all these baby carriages, and they're big because people often don't have cars, so they'll be, or they don't use the car, whatever. These big old-fashioned, to mind you, old-fashioned baby carriages. And I asked my wife, well, why do they have all these babies? And she says, babies in there. And I go, you're kidding me. And it actually was true. She said, look, I'm just feeling like I'm going to get arrested for, child abuse or whatever. But, they actually did. People would have their babies, in a restaurant. I mean, they're right there. So it's not as though they went out to wherever else and they just left their baby on the street. But, I could not imagine doing that in the United States in any major city that you go in the restaurant, your babies, I could not imagine doing that. But,
I think you could get arrested for that.
Yeah, I think you would. Again, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't recommend anyone do it. But in Denmark, it's apparently I shouldn't say apparently, it is a common practice. I mean, I saw it, as far as I know, it hasn't changed. So it just does speak volumes about trust that, people leave their baby and be pretty confident that it's going to be okay, so.
Yeah. So there's a lot in here. I mean, other topics, social capital we have in there, violence, the environment, civil liberties. Another interesting part of the project was that there are some things that are just hard to measure. And we didn't want to completely shy away from topics that were hard to measure. And the way we kind of finessed that was to put a couple of things in there where we just said, we don't think we can measure this very well. Here are some ideas, but it's really important anyway. National security was one of those where we said, we have the topic in there. We didn't put it in the summary at all because none of us really felt comfortable with any of the measures on national security. Civil liberties, we put one measure in there that we thought was pretty well done. That's press freedom threats. So the number of times that reporters have their equipment taken, or they're physically assaulted, or thrown in jail, or have their legal attacks on and trying to find their sources and things like that. And so we don't have a very long time trend for it, unfortunately, but we included it because the measures were very good for a short period. And we had this really sharp spike in the number of incidents against the press around the 2016 election, not shockingly. But so that's another, I think, worrisome sign, even though we don't have a long time trend on it. We do okay on that measure in absolute terms, but the recent spike in that is really worrisome.
Yeah, I can imagine that might change a year. Well, let's not speculate on the bad side. We'll see.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, and we'll look forward. Maybe I'll have you back when we get the state of the. Are you calling it the state of the states? I don't know. Whatever you're.
Yeah, it'll be on the same website, and it will be all embedded in there. But let's dig down a little bit more to the state level.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and I look forward to round 2.
All right. Thanks. I appreciate it, Dean. Thanks very much.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.